Hello and welcome back to Hill and Ponton's Veterans Disability Blog. I'm Natalia Joffrey, the company's COO.
And I'm attorney Rachel Cheek.
So we're going to continue our series on different aspects of veterans' disability claims. And today we're going to talk about depression and all that encompasses as it relates to a veterans' disability claim. Mm-hmm. And, you and I have discussed this before. There are different types of depression. Mm-hmm. You can have situational depression. You can have, like you were saying, sometimes you would just say, oh, I'm so depressed. That's not really what we're talking about today.
Right.
We're talking about true clinical depression. Mm-hmm. So can you share some symptoms of what clinical depression means?
Sure. So as with all conditions, all of these symptoms might not be present, but a lot of them are noted in depression cases. Right. So you can have feelings of disinterest in things that you used to formerly find interesting, different hobbies, activities you used to enjoy, just no longer really grab your interest, feelings, not feeling motivated, just feeling kind of stuck, feelings of worthlessness, of hopelessness. As you can imagine, those all can cause a low mood.
Right.
You don't feel your best if you're experiencing those kind of feelings. Sleep.
I'd like to give some examples as you go through.
Sure.
So when you're talking about, low motivation, like I want people to understand that sometimes low motivation, we're not talking about you going out and running a marathon. It could be like, I really don't feel like showering. I don't want to get out of bed to brush my teeth. That kind of level of low motivation.
Exactly. At work.
Yeah.
I know I need to do this project. I can't get started.
Yeah. I just really can't get into it. I see it a lot with people and their kids. Like, they love their children and they want to be with their children, but it's like it would take everything for them to actually sit there and play with their child because it's like they just can't muster the energy or the interest to really get in there and do something.
Right.
So you were saying motivation, disinterest. What would something else be?
Sleep problems are really a big one.
Yes.
So not being able to get to sleep, waking up, not being able to stay asleep, sleeping too much.
I'm glad you said that because a lot of people think, well, I don't have insomnia because I'm able to get to sleep, but then they can't stay asleep.
Right.
Or you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're just sitting there and you're sad and hating life and you're tired, but yet you can't sleep, right?
Yeah.
So that's a really good example.
Absolutely.
So we said the inability to sleep, and then you said the excessive sleeping, right?
Right. So that can be a problem as well. You want to stay in bed all day. Sometimes you want to stay in bed all day and you can't sleep. So that really contributes, it has to do with the motivation and the sleep problems.
Right.
Another common one is appetite changes. So you notice that you're eating way more than usual or way less than usual. Anything like that can be a symptom.
I'm glad that you mentioned that because oftentimes people think, well, I can't be depressed. Like, she's not depressed. She looks healthy, plump, in my case, if you will. But it could be the other, right? Because just the fact, lack of appetite, people often associate with depression.
Right.
But overeating can be just as dangerous and as big of a sign of depression.
Absolutely.
Trying to find that comfort somewhere and you sometimes find it in food.
Exactly.
Yeah, those are really good. So what typically happens when you file a claim for service-connected depression?
Well, when you file a claim for service connection, you first need to have a diagnosis of depression.
So when you say that, it means that just because I feel this way doesn't mean you technically have a claim.
Well, you can have a claim, but you don't have a diagnosis.
Right.
And in order to get service connection, you need a diagnosis.
Okay.
And so what will happen when you file a claim, generally, the VA will start to request records from you. See, do you have a diagnosis? Request certain information. And they'll often schedule for a compensation and pension examination in which if you don't have a diagnosis, you may get one. They'll sit you down with an examiner who's able to they'll go through an interview process with you, a questionnaire, and determine whether or not you do have a diagnosis. Now, whether or not those C&Ps are always right, that's a topic for different review. But
Okay.
it's what usually the process that begins to happen.
Gotcha. How can you prove that your depression was caused or aggravated by your time in service?
Great question. So the absolute, easiest way to do that is if you have a diagnosis of a mental condition in service. A lot of times people don't have that. I talk to clients all the time who say, look, I was in the Army. Do you think we were going, talking to, we weren't talking to psychiatrists. That was a sign of weakness, especially back in the day, back in the 60s and 70s, that was out of the question.
Very taboo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's becoming a little more okay now to seek mental treatment, even when you are still in the service. But still, many people that I talk to, even who served more recently, they didn't do that, and that's okay. That's that doesn't mean you don't have a plan. It's if you have one, it's the great. If you have a diagnosis during service, it's definitely easier to prove. But there are other ways that you can go about it.
Okay.
You can submit records from if you're being treated now. If sometimes I know you'll talk to the therapist that you're being treated for now, and they might make a note, depression due to such and such in service.
Okay.
You can submit statements. A lot of times what's really helpful is if you have statements from someone who either knew you before service, who knew you both before service, during and after. And it's really helpful is somebody say, yes, I knew Mr. Jones before he went into service. He was fine. He was social. He was happy. I didn't hear from him all of a sudden, when he was in. He came back out and it was like a different person. He didn't want to socialize. He seemed down, that sort of thing that can speak to changes. Spouse and family statements are always helpful.
Right. We so often hear that, don't we? Where people say they went in one person and came out another.
Very common. Very,
Yeah.
very, very
So
common.
that can actually serve as evidence, having a statement like that from a per se witness or just a family member or friend.
It's not, again, it's never a sure thing,
Right.
with the VA, but those certainly help. The VA is supposed to take a veteran's word, but they often require a little more information.
Gotcha. You mentioned other conditions. Can you claim depression as a secondary service-connected?
Yes.
Okay, issue.
So the way that works, and I see this all the time, is if you have service connection for prostate cancer. You served in Vietnam, you got connected. Well, it doesn't matter how you got connected. You're connected for prostate cancer. A lot of times I know that dealing with the cancer treatments, dealing with that diagnosis can be very mentally taxing. And I have seen multiple cases where a veteran is already service connected for one condition and they develop depression as a result of that. So I use cancer as an example. Another one I see a lot is orthopedic cases.
I was just going to say that. I used to see that a lot with people with back injuries.
Yes, back injuries.
Yes.
Well, any kind of orthopedic injury. Back is a big one because that really prevents you from doing anything. You're prevented from living a normal life, which really doesn't make your mental state feel very good.
Yeah.
And so you can develop depression secondary to that.
Yeah. I remember talking to clients and they would say, it hurts to sit, it hurts to stand, I can't walk very far, I can't play with my kids, I can't sleep because my back hurts. I mean, who wouldn't be depressed?
Yeah, how are you supposed to feel?
Yeah. So that, and so if they get that medically diagnosed, that would help their claim as well.
Absolutely. And you have to be service connected
Right.
for the condition that the depression is secondary to.
Okay.
First. But
Since we're talking about secondary conditions, so since we're talking about secondary conditions and how they relate to one another, can you file for two different mental health conditions at the same time? So, for example, depression and anxiety, or like depression and PTSD. Can you file both claims at once?
The short answer is yes.
Okay.
Yes, you can file claims for as many conditions as you have. The long answer is you can file those claims, but you won't be service connected. Well, you can be service connected for more than one mental health condition. You're not going to be rated more than once. So I see a lot of times veterans diagnosed with PTSD with major depressive disorder, with generalized anxiety disorder. And the way that VA will rate those is they look at the symptoms that are caused by both of those mental conditions, and they are required to rate you on whatever the highest symptoms are present. So it can be, you can have, maybe say you have anxiety, you have a little bit of like sleep impairment and irritability from your anxiety. You have PTSD and you're having constant flashbacks and suicidal ideation and irritability. You're blowing up at your friends and family members all the time. They're going to they'll consider maybe service connecting you for the anxiety, but they're going to rate based upon those PTSD symptoms, if that makes sense.
So it's almost like they're service connecting you for one major condition, if you will, and acknowledging the second, but they're not really rating you anymore for it.
Right, and that's because all mental health conditions are rated under the same criteria through the VA.
Okay. So when we're talking about not rating you anymore, that also means they're not paying you anymore.
Correct.
Right? Okay. Which is what people really
right. You can't be compensated for two mental health conditions separately.
Okay. So we're talking about rating. How does the VA rate for depression?
So the VA has for every condition, they have formulas that they work kind of go symptom by symptom and kind of separate out which symptoms are more severe. Obviously, those correspond to higher ratings, which symptoms are less severe, lower ratings. And you can look those up yourself. I mean, you can just Google VA rating criteria. If they're available online for anyone to see. So that could be helpful. You can kind of review and see what symptoms you have and maybe give you a good idea of what sort of rating you should expect or should be getting. Okay. So the way that VA rates mental conditions, they have a table and it ranges from 0% up to 100%. And if you like, I can go over just some symptoms in each category.
We're never going to say no.
Okay, great. So a 0% rating for mental condition, we'll use depression as an example. That's what we're talking about. So a 0% rating for depression is when you have a diagnosis, but you don't have symptoms that interfere with your work or your social life. Okay. So you got your service connected for depression, but you're not impaired by symptoms. So a 10% rating is when, again, you have a diagnosis, but your symptoms are generally controlled either by medication or they only come out in periods of significant stress. Okay. They only affect your life at that point. Next highest rating is 30%. And that's when you're generally functioning well, but you do have occasional social and occupational impairment because of the depression. So an example of that would be symptoms like chronic sleep impairment. And so basically, again, as we talked about, you're not able to get to sleep, you sleep too much, you're not able to stay asleep, symptoms like that, symptoms like depressed mood. Surprise, surprise, depressed mood is a criteria for depression. And so that's 30% rating is, again, when the VA recognizes that you do struggle with these symptoms, but you generally function okay. Your general behavior, conversation is normal, but during times of stress, you do maybe become a little less able to do your normal tasks. So they use occupational tasks as an example for a lot of these. So, and then if we're going up to 50%, we're talking about symptoms. We're talking about symptoms that cause reduced reliability. They kind of stop you from being able to, you can't rely 100% of the time you're going to be able to do your job tasks or do your everyday interactions with people. That although you're okay, you can do these jobs, you can do these tasks, you're not always able to. It's affecting your life on a more consistent basis. And so symptoms that are in that can be things like flattened affect is what they call it. Okay. So that's when, we're being happy and animated and talking. Flattened affect would be, well, now you like a 50% rating is when you have a fun
Right.
So
You're
you're not able.
It's like
to
you're
really,
there, but you're not really there.
Exactly.
Yeah,
You're not able to emote. You might have problems with your short-term memory, having trouble recalling information that you haven't known for very long. You might need to write things down on the calendar if you know you're not going to forget them. That type of thing.
Goodness gracious, and this is 50%.
50%. Oh,
goodness. So wow. Okay.
Panic attacks as well. Panic attacks are a huge thing.
Yeah.
They don't happen as much in depression, but they can.
Oh yeah.
And panic attacks that occur less than once a week, 50%. I don't know if you've ever had a panic attack, but from what I hear about them, you have one.
That's enough.
That's enough.
Yes.
That could be significantly more.
Wow. Yeah. These are really high standards to me. Okay, so because I love this VA math that we go from 10 to 30 and 30 to 50 because there's like no 20, no 30, and now we're at 50. Is there more than 50?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So 70% is where things really start getting, the VA really starts taking things seriously.
Yikes.
This is when
because 50% was, live with it. Okay.
Essentially.
Yeah. So now we're at 70. Okay.
70%. So 70% is when they recognize that you have pretty significant impairment in most of your areas of life. So your work, your work, your job, your social life, your thinking, your judgment, your mood, obviously. And so this is when we start looking at symptoms such as suicidal ideation, which is a big one. The suicidal ideation isn't necessarily a suicide attempt, isn't necessarily even having a suicide plan, but it's just having thoughts. And I talk to clients all the time who experience this. The thoughts don't have to be, oh my gosh, I'm going to kill myself. There can be thoughts like, wow, I just don't want to go through this anymore. Like, I can't have to wake up another day. Like, I wish I just wasn't here. It'd be easier if I wasn't around. Yeah. So things like that. And I know it's really hard a lot of people to open up about those kind of thoughts because, again, we talk about taboo. Although we're getting better with mental health treatment, we're not as open as we need to be as a culture.
And especially for veterans, they're brought up in this culture of like, suck it up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you just keep on going. And that doesn't work in the real world. Right. I mean, it just doesn't, when you can't go to work because you can't muster the gumption to even get out of bed. I mean, and I'm so glad that we're talking about clinical depression because people need to understand that this is where something is truly wrong with you that's out of your control. Right. This is not a desire thing, if you will. Use your willpower. Oh, that term.
I would love to. It's like somebody saying, "Oh, you have the flu. Just
power through it." Yeah. Power through it.
Just use your willpower. Get better. Yeah. It's a medical condition.
It's an actual medical condition. Okay. So after 70, good Lord, what comes next?
Right. Well, let me give you a couple more in 70. And so a big one in 70% is the inability to maintain or start relationships. That can be in work as well as socially. So that can be something where, your coworkers, obviously you have to have a working relationship, generally be pleasant. Your coworkers, your friends, generally I would say a normal social life is you socialize with other people. When you're talking about symptoms that are in the 70%, it's very hard for you to do that. And in fact, a lot of times I speak to people, they have symptoms of withdrawal. Even though they've been good friends with people, they just can't handle the stress of having to deal with maintaining these relationships. And so a lot of times they'll pull away from their friends and talk about, these are friends you already have. These are relationships that are already standing now. So imagine going through these symptoms and then trying to make new relationships. That's not going to happen. Yeah. So that's a big one as well. Okay. So
which would make it really difficult, by the way. So if you have to start a new job, how are you going to work if you can't even create relationships with brand new coworkers? So I understand that. Okay. So after 70, with this wonderful VA math, what comes next?
Right. 100%.
We go from 70 to 100.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Hallelujah.
Yep.
Okay.
So this is when, the VA recognizes that you're totally disabled just by virtue of your depression. And so this is when we're talking about symptoms such as delusions or hallucinations.
Okay.
And I know that might sound weird, or it might not sound like a symptom of depression, but I have seen cases in which someone has depression and that's accompanied by psychosis, which is what is the medical term for delusions or hallucinations, something that's not actually happening, but you're perceiving.
Okay.
So that can happen. Also symptoms, another one is, so we talked about suicidal ideation in 70%, persistent danger of hurting yourself. So if somebody has made multiple attempts at suicide, this is when we're going to start looking at the 100% or even hurting themselves. I know a lot of times self-harm can be a symptom of depression. And so that's a big one to look out for. Another one is what's called grossly inappropriate behavior. And so examples of this can be something like you're not behaving appropriately. It's something like drinking during church. I've talked to clients in the past who've mentioned, this has been a problem for me before. This has happened. Laughing during a funeral, responding inappropriately to normal interactions, that sort of thing. So.
Oh, those were really good examples.
Yeah, I mean, and when I say inappropriate behavior, it might not just be maybe not giving the right answer to a question. It's something that would make most people kind of stop and wonder about you.
Yeah, wonder what's going on.
Exactly. Something's happening. It's affecting your behavior. Your outer behavior as well as your interaction.
I know that at 70%, we talked about ideation, and that ideation doesn't necessarily mean to be that you attempted or anything like that, suicide. And then 100%, like if you've had an attempt or attempts, what if the person, because I often hear where doctors will ask the veterans if they have a plan. So what if they haven't attempted it, but they're thinking seriously about it, and they do have a plan and all of that? Would that possibly fall under the 100%?
That's something where it may come down to an argument by an attorney, or representative. But I would certainly argue that, like, if you have a plan and you know what you're going to do, I would argue that that's danger of hurting yourself.
Okay. So unemployability. Is unemployability possible if you have service-connected depression?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So as you can imagine us talking about going through these screening criteria, a big thing the VA looks at is whether your employment is affected, your occupational ability is affected by these symptoms. And so we started talking about the 70% category. If you are only service-connected for depression, but if you're at 70% or higher, you can be entitled to individual unemployability because your symptoms that we discussed are so severe and impair your life so much that they would prevent you from working or prevent you from being able to hold a job. And I do want to say, we only talked about a few examples. There's many, many more symptoms.
Right.
Again, you're welcome to go online and look up yourself the VA rating criteria. You'll see many things that we didn't discuss, but those symptoms as well interfere with employment and make you not be able to be reliable, coming to work, doing your job tasks, etc.
What are some difficulties with depression claims? Some challenges, anything else that you would share in terms of the difficulties in handling or processing those claims?
Well, I would say this is not from a lawyer perspective, but it's from a client perspective. I think it's really hard for some people to talk about it because you have to be honest. You have to, be open about what you're feeling. And a lot of these issues, again, as we continuously talk about, you were trained, it's drilled into you not to talk about this kind of thing. Not even to mention in general, as someone who hasn't served in the military, I know that even for just civilians, it's not always easy and to be open about how we're feeling when we're down. So that is something I would say. If you're going for service connection for depression, you have to be ready to talk about it. You have to be ready to discuss your symptoms. It is hard, but it is. If you don't, it can prevent you from getting compensation that you deserve.
Right.
Now, from the lawyer perspective, from doing the appeals, I would say sometimes it is difficult to get the connection to show, okay, yes, I have diagnosis. Here's why it happened in service. That can be difficult. So where again, we can help with that is we can review your records, your treatment records, kind of see what's popped up when. Just because you weren't treated doesn't mean that you don't have a condition either.
Okay.
So I'm answering 3 different paths at once.
Right.
There's several difficulties, but it is also difficult if you don't have treatment records. That can be. It's not a problem, and it doesn't prevent you from filing a claim or getting service connection. It just becomes a little more difficult. There's a little more workup that's needed.
Right. I think that sometimes people are their own worst enemies because, you mentioned these things and it's like people start to think about it. Oh, but I didn't have this and I didn't have that and this wasn't diagnosed. So it can't, this can't work for me. This can't apply to me. This probably means I'm going to get it. It's like, don't do that. Talk to someone that knows what they're doing and let them help you. Let them help you figure out what can we do in order to get the information that we need so that you can get the benefits that you're entitled to.
Exactly.
We're not making this up. This actually exists and is occurring. And there's different ways to get to where you need to be in order to qualify for benefits, right?
Absolutely. And just because there are difficulties doesn't mean it's impossible.
Right.
I've seen many cases where, there maybe wasn't any treatment from starting, it started 40 years after service, 40 years after this condition began happening and service connection was granted.
Right.
It differs from case to case. But again, if you are having any of these issues, you're recognizing any of these symptoms, it's definitely worth calling someone, seeing what can be done because, if you have depression and it was caused by service, you're entitled to service connection. End of story.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. That was super helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to visit our website or call our office. Otherwise, thanks for joining.